Hello, and welcome to Chapter 10, Public Opinion. So our obvious first question is, what do we mean by public opinion? What is public opinion? One definition of public opinion that comes from the 1940s and 1950s by V.O. Key, a famous political scientist of those times, said, "Those opinions held by private persons which governments find it prudent to heed." In other words, we're saying if you are not a member of the political community or you're not someone that government feels that they need to listen to, maybe you are not really part of public opinion. This is a very constricted view of what public opinion is. However, in some ways it certainly points to a good understanding of how government treats its citizens. When we consider public opinion, we can often divide the public into what are organized or diffuse interests. Organized interests such as interest groups, trade organizations, businesses, community organizations, clubs, even political parties, often work together and have very clear ideas of what they're trying to accomplish and have the resources to go out and to lobby Congress or other government officials to accomplish what they need to accomplish. Diffuse interests, on the other hand, are just the mass public opinion and what any given person tends to want or desire. And as such, it's often hard for governments to understand what people are asking for across the din of hundreds of millions of people trying to have their voices be heard. In addition to that, we probably could even debate what do we mean by the public. Any person within a political community, those who are voters, those who care, those who are willing to rally or raise money. In public opinion can mean many different things. In addition, we don't even agree on what we mean by opinion. Certainly, there's many different things that we have a take on, but does that mean that we're necessarily going to work to have our voices heard? Are we going to vote based on that opinion? What do we mean, and just how much do we really care? Even if we know what we mean about public opinion, that does not mean that we're going to be able to measure it. In fact, we very seldom even ask everyone any question when it comes to American political life. The closest we come to asking everyone is every 10 years when we hold the census. In the census, we only ask a couple questions. Who are you? Where do you live? What is your race, your ethnicity? Beyond that, we do not ask the American people very much at all. Now, on the other hand, we can ask a sample, and when we do, we run a risk that that sample is not going to be representative of the entire population. Now, even if it were representative of the entire population, there's a question as to whether people actually hold public opinions before the questions are asked. There's all sorts of things that we don't have a formed opinion about. However, when we're asked, then we begin to try to formulate in our mind what we mean, what is meant by the question, and how we feel about it. Some issues are actually not very important at all to us, but when we're surveyed, we tend to feel an obligation to give an answer. Now, some questions are, and some issues are very salient. Salient meaning they stand out, they're important, they're critical. And it would be important for us to know, useful for us to know, which are the questions that people care about in their day-to-day lives, even when there's not somebody standing in front of them or a computer prompt asking what their opinion is. And of course, there is always the problem of bias. Now, this could be bias in the selection of participants, but it could also be bias in the questions. Some questions we can ask actually seem designed to elicit a particular answer. And we need to be careful if we're trying to find out what people actually believe, that our questions don't suggest to the respondent a particular answer would be superior to some other answer. So you might ask, what is the origin of public opinion? What is the origin of the idea of opinion as we talk about it? Well, where do the individual opinions that collectively constitute public opinion come from? We tend to talk about the idea of underlying attitudes. An opinion is, in many senses, an attitude, and an attitude is an opinion, but the attitude aspect of it captures the internal workings in our mind, the organized and consistent manner of thinking and feeling and reacting within the mind, whereas the opinion is whatever's expressed publicly. And so when we think about attitudes, we're thinking not so much what somebody answers, what the answer to a question is. Instead, we're thinking about what causes the answer to the question, what reaction occurs in the brain that then we modulate out as the opinion. So when one states an opinion, it's an expression of an underlying attitude evoked by whatever choice is presented. So perhaps you have a very negative belief toward a political figure, but not a strong knowledge of a particular issue other than whether he supports it or opposes it. So your attitude might be your beliefs about that political figure as much as it is the actual policy issue that's involved. And so attitudes are a little more difficult to tease out than just an opinion is. You ask somebody a question, they'll give you an opinion. You need to then determine what exactly is causing the attitude. Attitudes, though, are not an organized system of beliefs. An organized system of beliefs is commonly called an ideology. And most people don't have organized systems of belief. In fact, they have different values that compete for dominance or centrality in their decision-making process. When you have an organized system of beliefs, it constrains your beliefs. It constrains your attitude selection. And instead, what it does is it causes you to balance and weigh the core beliefs against each other. Now, it's very convenient to organize people into political ideologies, even though that's not really correct. There's a couple reasons why the ideologies that we talk about are not very useful for us to understand people's beliefs. First of all, we've said that most people don't have consistent systems of beliefs, which is to say most people don't have coherent ideologies. But also, it's useful to note that in other countries, the terms we tend to use for ideology in the United States we say conservative or liberal or moderate. But that's, conservatives and liberals, that means something entirely different in other parts of the world. Our belief in government control versus freedom and all of this is often unique to the United States, at least in how we term these beliefs. In fact, you'll see in other parts of the world, for instance, that liberals and conservatives are fairly likely to work together politically, as opposed to other belief systems. But when we talk about it in the United States, we tend to say that conservatives tend to distrust government, hold traditional values, and place liberty ahead of civil rights, while supporting such concepts as order, security, and safety. Liberals, on the other hand, tend to trust government to end economic and social injustice, much more than conservatives would, to tolerate non-traditional and minority values, even at the expense of democracy, and then often at the expense of ideas like security and liberty as well, which is strange because, after all, liberty is, it's that same root word, liberty and liberal. Many people, of course, don't fit well in either camp, even though they have a well-ordered system of values. And part of this is because maybe conservative and liberal isn't really the ideological spectrum so much as is a way that we've chosen in this country to organize our political debates. So if most people don't have ideologies, what do they have? Well, they certainly have a range of core values that are in constant competition with each other. Liberty, equality, democracy, these are three values that are often referred to as American political values. Certainly, people claim to be in favor, right? These are valence issues, things that everybody is in favor of, and you struggle to show that you're more in favor of them than others. Although in reality, there's often a debate over which of these should, all well liked, which of them should be primary. You add to this the concept of security. Now, not everybody thinks of security as being as important a value, or at least that's not what people pay lip service to. I guess it's a first world, and even a first world during good times problem, to be able to say, well, if you're willing to trade liberty for security, you don't deserve either, right? That's this famous quote we hear all the time. But on the other hand, if you don't have some modicum of security, what good is liberty or equality or democracy? And can you even have liberty if someone can take away things from you on an individual basis without any recourse? Now, much as liberty, equality, democracy, and security are the things that we normally associate with political debate, there's other possible values that you could hold very high. In fact, that you could utilize to organize your belief structure. Religious faith and principles are very common concepts that people use. Pacifism. I have an aunt who believes that pacifism and even lack of conflict is the most important of all values. She's willing to fight you if you disagree with her idea that pacifism is important. And then hedonism, right? When I say hedonism, I mean this belief. You see it on memes all the time. They say YOLO, right? You only live once. And if you only live once, why would something relatively inconsequential, such as democracy, why would you dedicate your life to some abstract principle when there's the opportunity to have a pleasant time today? Certainly, a lot of people, whether they're willing to admit it or not, place hedonism really high in their core principles, and many others. I used to have a list of like 20 of these, and some more debatable than others. But maybe while you're stuck here in quarantine, you can think about, what are the values that really motivate you? The more broad, abstract concepts that you find most important. Maybe you'll say faith or family or the ability to look proper at all times. I'm not sure what your values will be. They're yours to decide. But you should think as to whether there's any values other than liberty, equality, democracy, and security that motivate your decision-making processes. Now, surprisingly, most people don't make their decisions based on ideology or values, at least not values as such. Really, it depends an awful lot on the team we associate ourselves with, that team being our party identification. On a psychological level, this is a term called partisanship. Now, partisanship is not ideology itself. Now, the political parties are structured a little bit along an ideological spectrum, I suppose. But, by the time you get to be my age, which is 50, you've seen that most of the, issues that motivated the political parties in your youth are no longer the major issues of today. And instead, the issues change, and yet the party alignment stays remarkably similar. There's a study conducted after the 1980 election that actually looked at why people had chosen to vote for Ronald Reagan over Jimmy Carter. And what they did was they went back and they looked at a group of people who had answered surveys back in the early 1970s. And then they surveyed them again after the 1980 election. This is called a panel study. So it's the same people at different times. And they found that the best predictor from the early 70s to the 1980s of who you would vote for was your political party affiliation in the early 1970s. So even though there had been hostage crises and the end of the Vietnam War and recessions and oil shocks and all sorts of things, what really influenced people's voting was their partisanship. This was less true for African Americans than for whites. And in fact, we see today that many, many African Americans vote for Democratic candidates. So, race definitely has an impact on voting today. But most people see themselves as either Democrats or Republicans or as independents who usually vote for one of the two political parties. Only about 10% of people are pure independents. And included in this are people who are libertarians and socialists and all of the various third party types, the Green Party, for instance. So it's really remarkable. And in election after election, we see that a great majority of the voters are voting for either the Republican or the Democratic candidate. Now, do they do that because only the Republican or Democrat can win? Or can only the Republican or Democrat win because they're doing this? In the next chapter, we'll talk about that a little more. Now, none of this would be important if partisanship was something that changed with every election. If the vast majority of people reorganized themselves politically after each election, but it turns out that party identification is persistent, psychological, and efficient. Persistent, that it doesn't change. Psychological, because there's an attachment. People don't say, I tend to vote with the Democrats. They say, I am a Democrat. And efficient. A great majority of the time, if you do not know very much about a candidate, but you vote for the candidate of your party, you'll be voting for the person who you would have chosen even if you had learned everything about that candidate. Sometimes you're wrong, but the great majority of the time, it proves to be a very useful cue to save time. Partisanship often precedes your attitudes. Oftentimes, your beliefs are taught to you, or socialized to you, or given to you by listening to the leaders of the political parties that you already belong to. And so do you have the belief you have because you're a Democrat, or are you a Democrat because of the belief that you have? Often that's impossible to tease out. I said earlier that race and ethnicity are very important in determining voting patterns and beliefs. The sharpest differences of opinion between major groups in U.S. politics occur between African Americans and whites. And not surprisingly, the biggest gap is on issues related to race. This could involve things like discrimination and effects related to discrimination. Other areas of differentiation are found in greater support by African Americans for government services such as jobs and health care, and less support for defense spending and the death penalty. You could come up with reasons why this is, but it's probably often that African Americans have seen government action as being useful in securing civil rights, and also that things like the death penalty are often applied in controversial ways as related to race, and reflect profoundly different perceptions of life experiences for African Americans versus whites. When compared to race, gender has a much smaller impact on voting. In fact, you might see that a clear portion of gender differences in voting are related to two things. First, women, at least amongst minorities, tend to vote at much higher rates. So if you have a political party such as Republicans who do dismally amongst minorities, and then you see that that women tend to, in minority groups, tend to vote much more often, then you're going to see a gender gap. What that is really, in many respects, the racial and ethnic gap that we talked about in the previous slide. Married people tend to vote almost exactly the same. There is, if you, there was much talk in the 2016 election about President Trump doing badly amongst married white women. But as it turned out, President Trump won amongst married white women. It is actually amongst single men and single women where you see the largest gender gap. Single men are much more likely to vote for Republicans than single women. You could probably create an explanation for that, but you see that between men and women, barely a double-digit difference in voting in most elections. So when you compare this to African Americans and whites, and Latinos and whites, and Asians and whites, like I said, the breadth of minority groups, gender is a very small demographic difference. Single versus married, now that is a very big difference. So in addition to race and gender, There are several other factors that cause people to differ politically. If you look at the difference between Republicans and Democrats, Republicans are more religious, more likely middle class or wealthy, suburban, or rural, and older. And, as people age, they become more religious, wealthier, more likely to be suburban and older. However, we have different age cohorts across time, and it will be interesting to see that when the young people of today reach their 40s, 50s, 60s, whether their views will have changed, as we see with many generations going back previously, or whether that is going to cause a difference across time. Certainly it causes a difference across time when it comes to what people's actual beliefs on issues are. And then the political parties tend to shift in order to capture the new middle of popular views. However, if we look at all of these differences, religion, class, wealth, where you live, and age, they all pale in comparison with societal differences and voting differences when it comes to race. So anyway, I would make sure that I look through this chapter and try to discover as much useful information as I can. The next two chapters are going to be dealing more with elections and politics, and starting out with a good foundation in public opinion proves very useful.